Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Bravo, Dean of the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Birch Bayh Lecture. Before I start with the formal introductions, I would like to take a moment to review some administrative matters related to this virtual program. We are aware that many of our attendees today wish to obtain continuing legal education credit, CLE. For those participants interested in earning CLE hours, please note the following. 1, to obtain CLE credit, we must be able to monitor your participation and engagement throughout the duration of today's presentation. As a result, you cannot earn CLE credit by joining the webinar by old-fashioned audio phone. So please tune in via computer or the Zoom app on your smartphone. To monitor engagement, there will be 3 polls administered during the presentation. Please pay attention when those pop up and answer the poll questions. For questions related to CLE credit, please contact Elizabeth Allington at the email address on your webinar screen. During the presentation today, we welcome your questions to our speaker and invite you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens to engage with our presenter. We have reserved about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end, and I will facilitate that by reading some of the questions that come in. Now, having addressed these procedural matters, I am very pleased to welcome you again to the 2021 Birch Bayh Lecture. This lecture was established here at IU McKinney in honor of the late US Senator Birch Bayh and in recognition of his long and distinguished career in government. Indeed, the Bayh Lecture has become a much anticipated event on our law school calendar, and we are grateful to all those who have made it possible. We especially want to express gratitude to Simon Property Group, where Senator Bayh served on the board for 17 years, and to the Friends of Birch Bayh. We're very grateful for their support, as well as the support and friendship over the years of Kitty Bayh and Chris Bayh, who are joining us this evening for this virtual presentation. We're extremely pleased that they're able to be with us. Former US Senator and Indiana Governor Evan Bayh has extended his regrets that he is unable to join us this evening. This lecture series focuses on issues of importance to Senator Birch Bayh, and so we have a virtually unlimited list of subjects to address in years to come, simply because Senator Bayh's interests were so vast and varied, and his legacy is so far-reaching. Among his many accomplishments, Senator Bayh authored the landmark Title IX to the Higher Education Act, which prohibits discrimination based on the basis of sex in our schools. He authored the Disaster Relief Act that became the foundation for FEMA, the Privacy Protection Act, and the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. He created the framework for the presidential transition through the 25th Amendment on presidential and vice presidential disability and succession, and the 26th Amendment lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. He also wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, which could yet become law. In fact, Senator Bayh is the only person since James Madison to draft multiple amendments to the US Constitution. Another of Senator Bayh's areas of passionate interest was in securing America's place as a world leader in life sciences and biotechnology. Our speaker today is Joseph P. Allen. Mr. Allen served on the staff of the US Senate Judiciary Committee, helping Senator Bayh secure passage of the Bi-Dole Act, a legislation that, and this is by no means hyperbole, completely revolutionized US patent law to the tune of an estimated $1.7 trillion impact on the American economy by, among other things, making our universities, including our own Indiana University, leading incubators of scientific, medical, and technological innovation. In short, as in the musical Hamilton, Mr. Allen was, quote, in the room where it happened. I can't sing, otherwise I would. Since 2008, Mr. Allen has led Joseph Allen and Associates, a consulting firm specializing in technology management and intellectual property issues, and he leads the Bi-Dole Coalition, an alliance of scientific, research, and commercial organizations committed to promoting this landmark law. Mr. Allen, we are delighted to welcome you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. For any of those of us who work with Senator Birch Bayh, being asked to talk in a lecture series named for him is really an honor, and I sincerely mean that. Today, we'll discuss how and why the University and Small Business Patent Procedures Act, or Bi-Dole as it's commonly called, was created, what it does, how it works, and why it's under attack. But I also hope to give you a glimpse of what it was like to work for Senator Birch Bayh, a man who changed my life and illustrated what it means to be a real public servant. That the Bi-Dole Act passed was amazing. That it passed in a lame duck session of Congress with its principal author defeated, the US Senate changing hands, and a sitting president thrown out was a miracle. Even then, success was not assured. The bureaucracy was waiting to undermine the implementing regulations. Yet the new law survived, strengthening the economy while improving public health and well-being. Bi-Dole has literally changed the world. It revived our economy, improved lives around the globe. It caused our best and brightest minds in the public and private sectors to work together to solve critical problems like COVID-19, and is being adopted internationally as a recognized best practice. But despite its incredible impact, Bi-Dole remains under attack today from those who tried to kill it 40 years ago. This is my staff's eye view of the Bi-Dole Act. In 1978, I was a low-level staffer Senator Bayh inherited when he took over the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights. I'd worked for Senator John Tunney, son of the former heavyweight champion of the world, and the subject of the movie The Candidate, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, about a bright young man running for the Senate against an established incumbent. He unexpectedly wins, and the movie ends with Redford asking his campaign manager, played by Dustin Hoffman, "What do we do now?" Senator Tunney was a very nice person, but never figured out the answer and was defeated. I was fortunate enough to remain on the staff when Senator Bayh's team took over and was a low-level research assistant. One day, Senator Bayh's office called our general counsel, Nels Ackerson, and asked us to meet with Purdue University, which had some sort of patent problem. Nels asked if I wanted to sit in, and I did. Ralph Davis of Purdue came in, along with Norman Latker, the patent counsel for the National Institutes of Health, and Howard Brimmer with the University of Wisconsin's Alumni Research Foundation. I had no idea that in meeting Norm and Howard, I was meeting two people who would become my lifelong mentors. They explained that under the current policies, when a university made an invention with federal support, that it was taken away by the funding agency and was then doomed to gather dust on the shelf because there was no incentives for anyone to develop it into a product. A very successful administrative policy of the National Institutes of Health designed to end this waste by granting patent rights to universities with technology transfer offices was being terminated by the Carter administration. Purdue had several potentially important inventions which were being taken, and they asked if we could look into the situation to see if there's anything Senator Bayh could do to stop this waste. They handed us a draft bill which they thought might help. After they left, Nels asked me to look into the issue. The economy was in on a tailspin. Combining double-digit inflation with double-digit unemployment created what was termed the misery index. The federal government funded 50% of US research in those days, but few inventions made it to the marketplace. The government's policies dating back to World War II was that any invention made with federal support would be taken away from the creator and made available to anyone through non-exclusive licensing by the government. Federally funded inventions are normally embryonic, more like ideas than products, requiring considerable industry time and expense to develop. Because this investment could not be protected, few of these inventions were ever licensed, much less commercialized. Further, there were no incentives for the inventors on campus to help in the development. Because these policies were so wasteful, administrative programs had sprung up, allowing the creating organization to petition the government to waive patent rights to them, but it normally took 18 months to get a reply, and that was often no. I discovered that less than 5% of the 28,000 inventions the government owned were even being licensed. Even worse, not a single new drug had been commercialized from the billions of dollars NIH had been funding in research under these policies. They had created a chasm between our best and brightest minds in the public and private sectors as companies avoided working with universities and federal laboratories from legitimate fears of losing resulting invention rights. As the government claimed ownership, even if it only funded a small percentage of the R&D. While keeping our own companies at bay, we were giving our foreign rivals access to research ideas which they exploited against us. I reported my finding to Nels, and we recommended to Senator Bayh that he pick up the issue. We also learned that Senator Robert Dole was interested in the problem and suggested we reach out to his staff to see if they wanted to work together. Senator Bayh gave us the green light and the wheels began to turn. This raised an interesting possibility. Senator Bayh was a liberal Democrat and Senator Dole a conservative Republican. Both served on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Both reached the same conclusion. Patent incentives must be restored to the federal R&D system. They were happy to work together to make that happen. The political combination of Birch Bayh and Bi-Dole was formidable. Together, they bridged the partisan divide. We introduced a draft bill at the end of the 95th Congress, and in a typical Birch Bayh gesture, he let Senator Dole put his name on it first as we circulated the bill for comments, so an improved version could be submitted when the new Congress reconvened in 1979. That was rarely done, as the senator whose party was in the majority always went first. It was understood it would be Bi-Dole when the bill was reintroduced, but that kind of gracious gesture was typical of Birch Bayh and was a reason why he got along with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. We asked the Comptroller General, who previously documented the problems at NIH, to do a study for us on the impact of current federal patent policies. At that time, the Japan Inc. model was then in vogue, as they were threatening to eclipse us economically. It was typified by big government working with big industry backed by big labor unions to guide national economic development. Many in our government were attracted to a Washington-centric model for shaping the economy, and still are. Bi-Dole chose a different direction. We decided that innovations are best managed by those who create them. So we decentralized technology management from Washington to the universities and small companies making inventions with government support. Universities could own and license their discoveries as long as they gave preference to companies which would make resulting products substantially in the United States. They were required to give a preference to licensing small companies, which historically drive innovation. Academic institutions could keep any resulting royalties, but they had to be shared with their inventors and used for funding more research or to pay for tech transfer costs. The government could use the discoveries they supported royalty-free. Federal laboratories were authorized to license their inventions with the same small business preference and domestic development preferences as universities. And the government could march in, requiring universities to license additional companies if it appeared that good faith efforts were not being made to commercialize an invention, or if the developer could not meet the needs of a national emergency. Finally, the bill would replace the jumble of more than 20 different patent policies then in place among the agencies. Some agencies had multiple policies in place for various programs, creating utter confusion for those trying to deal with them. If there's one thing companies require if they're going to partner with the public sector, it's a clear understanding of the rules and an assurance they won't be arbitrarily changed after they've assumed the risk of commercialization. Nels was invited to speak at a conference of university patent administrators on our bill. A few days before he was supposed to leave, he hurt his back. He asked if I would fill in. That was a pretty terrifying prospect, as I'd never done anything like that before. But because someone needed to be there, I said that I would. I recognized the audience knew a lot more about the subject than I did. So I described what we were doing, said we wanted to help solve the problem they faced, and asked for their advice and support. I met a lot of people that I would work with for many decades in that room. As Congress reconvened, we held a press conference showcasing university inventions at risk. The inventors explained that medical discoveries would not alleviate human suffering unless they were turned into products. That would not happen when government destroyed the incentives of patent protection. The event got great press coverage. The next day, the National Enquirer, a notorious supermarket tabloid, called. "Is it possible the cure for cancer is being suppressed?" they asked. I replied, "Anything's possible, but that was hardly likely." For weeks, I glanced nervously at the checkout counters to see if a headline screamed, "Government hides cure for cancer." Luckily, that story didn't run. We began to get co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. The bill was gaining attention, with Senator Bayh being frequently asked to speak about it. One incident says a lot about what it was like to work for Birch Bayh. He was invited to speak to the American Bar Association in a large auditorium in Washington. I had gone with him, and as a good staffer, I took the most obscure seat I could find on the very end of the front row. Many members of Congress keep their staff in the shadow as much as possible, so the spotlight only shines on them. That's certainly their prerogative, but that wasn't Birch Bayh's style. As he finished speaking, he suddenly said, "If you have any questions on the bill, please get in touch with my staffer, Joe Allen. Joe, where are you?" I briefly waved my hand, but that wasn't good enough for Senator Bayh. "Please stand up so they can see you." As a staffer, you don't forget things like that, which is why we would walk through a wall for Senator Bayh. In the spring, we held our first hearing. We'd received many good suggestions for improving the bill, which we incorporated, but had nothing back from the Carter administration. We asked the Comptroller General of the United States, Elmer B. Statz, to conduct a study of federal patent policies then in place. Statz knew the subject well, and he had the clout to get data from elected agencies showing how ineffectively taxpayer-supported R&D was being managed. He confirmed the government's patent policies were not working. University and small business witnesses described how detrimental the current policies were to American innovation. The Carter administration had not taken a position on the bill, so they did not testify. However, Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, appeared under full steam. Rickover was a staunch believer that whatever the government funded should be freely available. Experience in the nuclear industry showed that patents were not critical to development, he said. We soon discovered that consumer advocate Ralph Nader held the same dim view of our bill. Rickover and Senator Bayh had a lively debate on the merits of the patent system. Because of his age and stature, Senator Bayh was very courteous in his questioning of Admiral Rickover. The Admiral deeply believed in his view. He also had a close ally in Congress, Senator Russell Wong of Louisiana. Senator Long was the son of the legendary Governor Huey the Kingfish Long, the subject of the novel and the movie All the King's Men. Senator Long chaired the powerful Senate Finance Committee overseeing tax policy. He was a good example of how Congress used to work before everything was televised and members learned how to preen for the cameras. Once Senator Long was asked by another senator about the intricacies of a pending tax reform provision being considered. "If I have to explain it to you, we'll be here all day. Just vote yes." And they did. Senator Long greatly admired Admiral Rickover, sharing his views on government patent policy. Long was not someone you crossed lightly. We hoped that limiting our bill to universities and small companies would avoid his wrath if we got to the full Senate vote. Universities and small companies were the crux of the problem anyway, but first we had to get out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The next step was the committee markup. This is when the Judiciary Committee reviews the bill, makes any amendments, and then votes it up or down. If approved, the bill proceeds to the full Senate consideration. The committee had the most liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans in Congress, but the political alliance of Birch Bayh and Bi-Dole, with support from university and small businesses, was our secret weapon. One day, Chairman Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and Ranking Minority Member Strom Thurmond of South Carolina independently called our office to co-sponsor our bill. I made a beeline to the Senate chamber to give Senator Bayh the good news. Mischievously looking up from his reading glasses, he said, "Are you sure this bill is okay?" We both laughed, as not many bills were being supported by two senators usually diametrically opposed on most issues. But Bi-Dole was an exception. As we prepared to have the bill voted on in the Judiciary Committee, we got a visit from General Electric, then one of the most dominant companies in the country. The Department of Defense allowed prime contractors like GE to own inventions they made, but not universities or small companies. GE requested that Senator Bayh insert a provision stating that passage of Bi-Dole was not intended to undercut DoD practices for companies not covered under our bill. If such language were accepted, GE pledged it would not block passage of Bi-Dole, even though competing legislation by the Carter administration and Senator Stevenson of Illinois was being prepared, focusing on big business as opposed to our approach. That seemed like an offer we shouldn't refuse, so we inserted language making that pledge. That would later come back to help us when the time came for a showdown on which approach would prevail. The night before the committee vote in December 1979, we were visited by the Carter administration. They had sat on our bill for over a year. I was astounded when the congressional liaison asked me to postpone the markup while they developed an alternative approach to compete against us. I replied, we'd waited long enough. Congress is already half over, so they could forget about asking us to slow down so they could have more time to go off in a different direction. The administration would later make their presence felt, to our dismay. We'd also been contacted by Senator Metzenbaum's office a few days before the crucial committee vote. Metzenbaum was close to Ralph Nader, and we were concerned about where he would come down on our bill. His staffer said that if we would expand coverage of Bi-Dole to nonprofit research organizations like the Battelle Memorial Institute in Metzenbaum's state of Ohio, that he would become a co-sponsor. Senator Bayh was happy to make this change as it broadened the impact of the legislation while preserving its spirit. When the markup began in the Senate Judiciary Committee, everything was going according to plan until Metzenbaum spoke. He read a laundry list of concerns about our bill before finally concluding that he would support it. If I'd had any idea that was going to happen, I would have warned Senator Bayh, and I was not very happy when I confronted Metzenbaum's staffer afterwards. When I asked her what that was all about, she could only shake her head and say, he slipped the leash. On Capitol Hill, your word is your bond. And when you've made a deal, you're expected to stick by it. If that can't be relied on, you become ineffective. I walked away feeling appreciative that I worked for somebody like Birch Bayh. I never had to worry about him pulling a stunt like that. There were three basic schools of thought opposing Bi-Dole. One was the public interest philosophy that government-funded technology should be put in the public domain, freely available to all. Admiral Rickover and Ralph Nader fell into this camp, despite its documented failure. Another was the belief that large companies were more important than universities or small businesses in driving the economy and should be the real focus of the new policy. This is where the Carter administration and the Senate Commerce Committee would come out. There was also opposition to the decentralization of technology management out of Washington. This belief was particularly strong at the Department of Energy, DOE. To understand the motivation of DOE, it's important to review the nature of the agency. Despite its name, it's home to the laboratory system that developed the atomic bomb and devotes a large percentage of its R&D to nuclear weapons-related research. The resulting culture emphasizes protecting national security through close control of its technologies. They had amassed a large team of lawyers, laboriously processing case-by-case waivers for patent ownership. Thus, it's easy to see why the decentralized approach of Bi-Dole was a serious threat to that established culture and their jobs. The Judiciary Committee unanimously approved Bi-Dole, reporting it to the full Senate. We are now at the point of great peril. We continue to hear from Admiral Rickover. He was vigorously prodding Senator Long to fight us. We would soon know if Rickover succeeded or not. The actual hit came from an unexpected direction. Giving up on dissuading us, the administration moved to the Senate Commerce Committee. They developed a rival bill geared toward large contractors, arguing that these companies perform the majority of federal R&D. Senator Bayh met with Senators Stevenson and Cannon, who led the Commerce Committee. Bayh argued that universities and small companies were those suffering most from the current policies, and that they were the ones most likely to make breakthrough discoveries with federal funding. Further, the alternative approach was not politically feasible, as it was sure to draw Senator Long's ire. Bayh's views were rejected. Just before the Senate was scheduled to debate Bi-Dole in February 1980, all Senate offices received a Dear Colleague letter from the Commerce Committee. They intended to amend our bill to include big business. Senators Bayh and Dole replied with a rebuttal letter. Both sides worked the phone hard that night, lining up support. The next day showed who had the votes. After a lively debate, we handily beat back the amendment. However, just as the vote concluded, Senator Long emerged. He was not a happy man. As Senators Stevenson and Cannon fled, Senator Bayh whispered to me, "Great, they're leaving me to clean up their mess." I had a good relationship with Wiley Jones on Senator Long's staff. Senators Long and Bayh also got along very well. Wiley and I agreed not to sandbag each other. Long feared that Bi-Dole was a Trojan horse, limited at first, but later expanding to include big business. Senator Bayh pledged to fight any such efforts, but the Commerce Committee had waved a red flag before a very powerful bull. When he charged, you knew it. Senator Long's seat was directly behind Senator Bayh. As a staffer, I was sitting beside my boss on the Senate floor. Senator Long soon brought further consideration of Bi-Dole to a screeching halt, muttering to us, "This is the worst bill I've ever seen in my life." Long told the presiding officer that he had several amendments to our bill. It became obvious that the debate would take much longer than the Senate leadership had allocated. We had to pull Bi-Dole from the floor. Under the rules, one senator can greatly complicate consideration of a bill. They can object to its being scheduled. They can drag out debate offering endless amendments or use parliamentary maneuvers like the filibuster. As the 96 Congress got closer and closer to Election Day, non-essential bills were severely limited on the time allocated for debate. 3 precious months were spent working behind the scenes with Senator Long's office to reschedule Bi-Dole. In late April 1980, we succeeded, again pledging to oppose any attempts to broaden it. The bill passed the Senate 91-4. Senator Long voted no. Meanwhile, the House was also looking at federal patent policies. Consideration began on the House Science and Technology Committee and then onto the House Judiciary Committee. The end of the Congress was rapidly approaching. The Carter administration gained support for their approach in the House, which included big business. The reaction was predictable. On September 24th, 1980, Senator Bayh received a public letter from Senator Long, quote, "I am adamantly opposed to the House bill. I urge you to join with me in taking whatever steps are necessary to prevent this monopolistic provision from being included in the final form of any patent policy legislation." 2 days later, Bayh replied, "I will offer an amendment to bring any House-passed patent policy into conformity with that already passed by the Senate, which, as you know, is strictly limited to universities and small businesses." And there things stood on Election Day 1980. Jimmy Carter was initially viewed as a political outsider who would change Washington. Continued missteps, an economy spiraling downward, and the Iranian hostage crisis ate away his support. Americans felt it was time to clean house. I vividly remember election night. I was sitting on my couch with my then 5-year-old son, Zach, watching the returns. I was explaining elections to him and that my boss, Senator Bayh, was running for re-election, excuse me, and it would probably be a long while before we know who'd won. Just then the polls closed. Walter Cronkite announced on TV that Indiana had gone to Ronald Reagan and Birch Bayh had lost. I gasped. My son looked at me, realizing I'd lost my job, and said, "Dad, does that mean I don't get an allowance anymore?" And he wasn't far from wrong. Carter had lost to Reagan, Birch Bayh lost, the Senate went to Republican control for the first time in decades. But we remained in office until new Congress began 2 months later. However, Congress had recessed without enacting a budget, so a lame duck session was necessary. That provided a glimmer of hope for Bi-Dole, but Senate policies for bringing up non-budgetary bills were strict. They must pass unanimously. The House combined several patent-related provisions into one bill, including their version of patent policy. Their bill manager was Representative Robert Kastenmeier of Wisconsin. Through informal negotiations, we made it clear that we could not accept this approach as evidenced by Senator Long's letter. The House would not back down. We stopped talking. However, the University of Wisconsin was a large part of Kastenmeier's district, and they backed Bi-Dole. One afternoon, I received a call from Bruce Lehman, later the Patent and Trademark Commissioner under President Clinton. Bruce was Representative Kastenmeier's staffer on their bill. He offered a deal. They would include our patent policy if we would accept the rest of the omnibus patent bill. I ran it past Senator Bayh, and he gave the green light. The House would pass the bill with Bi-Dole included. We would then pass their revised bill without any changes. However, if even one senator objected, we were sunk. I contacted the Senate Majority Leader's office to schedule a vote as soon as the House acted. The majority and minority leaders then alert their respective members to see if anyone objects to bringing up the bill. Congress was adjourning at any moment as soon as the final parts of the budget deal were completed. I received a call. We would not be scheduled because a Democratic hold had been placed on our bill. Under the procedures, any senator can anonymously hold legislation blocking consideration. I checked with Wiley Jones. He said that Long had not placed the hold. There was another likely candidate, Senator Stevenson. He had developed rival legislation that would become the Stevenson-Weidler Act. Stevenson, like Bayh, was leaving Congress. I went looking for his staffer. Finding him in the Senate cafeteria, we had a direct conversation. I said the two could play this game. If the hold wasn't lifted on Bi-Dole, anything with Stevenson's name on it would have a similar hold, and they would not even have to guess who'd done it. Without waiting for a reply, I turned around and left. We soon heard the hold was removed. However, the majority leader's staff said because of Senator Long's interest, they had to call his office to make sure he wasn't going to object. Minutes later, my phone rang. It was Wiley Jones. I have two questions for you. One is from Senator Long and one is from me. He asked if Senator Bayh really wanted the bill, and I said that he did. Wiley then asked if it'd be better for me not to pass the bill so I could find a new boss and have a job next year. Moved by his thoughtfulness, I replied it was now or never for passing Bi-Dole. He said okay and hung up. Senator Long immediately called Senator Bayh. Birch, you can pass your damn patent bill, and I'm really going to miss working with you. I ran to the Senate chamber. It was in chaos like the fall of Afghanistan. Staff fought to get bills in line for consideration while there was still time to get out. In the confusion, I found the majority leader's staffer. He said there was an opening in 10 minutes, but if we weren't ready, it would go to somebody else. I called for Senator Bayh. He was at a press conference and would take 20 minutes to return. My heart sank. I looked around the Senate cloakroom. There stood Bob Dole. Running over, I explained our dilemma. Senator Dole said, "Follow me," and we went out to the Senate floor. I handed him the statement I'd written for Senator Bayh. We wrote on it Senator Dole, and he read it and asked for the vote. On November 21st, 1980, Congress passed H.R. 6933 that included the Bi-Dole Act. We had done it, or so we thought. After congressional passage, legislation moves to the president's desk for signature. The Constitution says in Article 1, Section 1, quote, "If any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, Sundays accepted, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he'd signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevents its return, in which case it shall not be a law." Congress had adjourned, so the president could pocket veto Bi-Dole by simply ignoring it. We heard that DOE was working the White House against the bill. As the days ticked by without the president's signature, we became increasingly alarmed. Our ally in the fight was the Office of Advocacy in the Small Business Administration. Headed by Milt Stewart, who later founded Inc. magazine, they supported Bi-Dole over the Carter administration's proposal. Milt had worked with Stuart Eisenstadt, Carter's chief of staff, organizing a very successful small business conference before the election. Deftly countering DOE, Stewart cleared the roadblocks. On the very last day, President Carter signed Bi-Dole into law. In January, we were out of office, along with many others who'd lost in the Reagan landslide, including officials of the Carter administration. They had a special day at the DC unemployment office for us to sign up. There's nothing more humbling than standing in line along with former officials of government agencies. A couple of weeks later, I was able to get a job with another senator who was interested in picking up patent issues. I wrote a memo outlining some potential actions he could take. The memo came back with a notation in red ink at the top from the chief of staff. "We don't use exclamation marks in this office," he said. Having worked for Birch Bayh, I knew I would never make it in an office that didn't use exclamation marks. Soon I found a job leading a trade association of research-intensive companies. Even though Bi-Dole was enacted, it was still in jeopardy. Any law is only as effective as its implementing regulations. With Senator Bayh gone and the new Reagan administration just settling in, DOE had a golden opportunity to smother the fledgling law in its crib. While Bi-Dole held the general principle that universities and small companies making inventions with federal support could own them, we stipulated that in exceptional circumstances, the agencies could provide otherwise. Congress envisioned situations where government agencies were actually developing the technology or where national security concerns prevailed. The Department of Energy launched their assault using this provision. They tried to exempt broad categories of research from our law. Luckily, we had the right person in place to guide the regulations. Norman Latker had been fired from NIH for working with us, but Senators Bayh and Dole got him relocated to the Office of Management and Budget. So that's where our bill put the oversight of the new law. It took Norm over a year to fight off DOE's attacks and get the final regulation in place. One of the reasons he succeeded was that the incoming Reagan administration embraced Bi-Dole. The Office of Management and Budget sits in the White House. And before long, the new political appointees learned about the fight over Bi-Dole. At the same time as it was approving Bi-Dole, Congress also passed another law encouraging the commercialization of federally funded R&D from our old friend, Senator Stevenson, who tried to kill our bill. His law sought to establish cooperative research centers to encourage industry-university collaborations and required federal laboratories to establish an office to promote technology transfer. However, the Stevenson-Weidler Act did not remove many of the legal barriers preventing federal laboratory technologies from being commercialized. The incoming Reagan administration declined to fund the cooperative research centers authorized in the bill, preferring the Bi-Dole decentralized technology management approach. President Reagan issued a memorandum endorsing Bi-Dole, which was later reinforced by an executive order, which remains in place until this day. Norm later relocated to the Department of Commerce, and Senator Dole amended Bi-Dole, moving oversight to Commerce so Norm could continue to protect and nurture it. In addition to fighting the regulations, DOE made it clear he had no intention of using the discretion provided in Bi-Dole to allow its university-operated federal laboratories to manage their inventions. Thus, the discretionary nature of the provision was an insufficient carrot for change. Policymakers reached for the stick. In the first term of President Reagan, it became apparent that something significant was occurring under Bi-Dole. Shortly before the law passed, the Supreme Court held in Diamond v. Chakrabarty that human-made organisms were patentable. Then 2 years later, the trade association I was heading worked with a broad coalition and got Congress to create the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, renewing confidence in the reliability of the U.S. patent system. These changes, combined with the authorities and incentives of Bi-Dole, helped launch a whole new industry, biotechnology. The enabling technologies were created on campus, but few established companies were willing to invest in such a high-risk new field. Because universities now own their inventions, they began spinning out startup companies like Genentech. Soon the US had overtaken England and Japan's lead, and we never looked back. To this day, the industry is characterized by small companies clustered around our research universities. University patenting was soaring, as were the number of licenses and R&D alliances forming with the private sector. However, nothing similar was happening with the federal laboratories. In 1983, President Reagan asked David Packard to investigate how to get similar results from the federal laboratories. Packard reported that the labs lacked comparable tech transfer authorities as Bi-Dole had given the universities. As we have seen, the Bi-Dole Act allowed the government to license its inventions on a more effective basis. Federal inventors had been sharing royalties with their agencies in the rare cases where a patent was successfully commercialized before Bi-Dole. But 2 years after Bi-Dole passed, the Office of Personnel Management ruled that royalty sharing would no longer be permitted because they said there was no specific legislative authority allowing the agencies to keep royalties they received. Instead, any such income had to go to the Treasury Department. That meant that the cost of patenting and licensing was borne by the agencies, but any resulting income went to Treasury. With this critical incentive destroyed, it was hardly surprising the labs were lagging behind the universities. At about the same time, I left the trade association when Norm invited me to join his office at the Department of Commerce. It had become the center for developing and implementing federal technology management policies and seemed like an exciting place to be for anyone who wanted to make an impact in a rapidly emerging field. With the defeat of Senator Bayh, Senator Dole ably picked up the mantle. He was growing increasingly frustrated by continuing resistance at DOE. As it became apparent that legislation would be needed to compel change, Dole contacted us, asking us for help in amending Bi-Dole to extend its authorities to the federal laboratories. The new Dole legislation was quickly approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee with little debate. The night before it was scheduled for a Senate vote, DOE sent an assistant secretary to Dole's office to try to dissuade him from proceeding. Dole's staff called Norm Lacker and me to a late-night showdown. Dole's staff made it abundantly clear to DOE they had no intention of backing off. The bill was passed unanimously the next day and sent to the House of Representatives. However, since the House companion bill was more limited, a compromise was reached as Congress ground to the end of the session. The final law extended the provisions of Bi-Dole to university-operated federal laboratories. However, the authorization covering laboratories like NIH, which are run by government employees, was dropped. Senator Dole left the Judiciary Committee to become the Senate Majority Leader. Senator Slade Gorton, a Republican from Washington State, contacted our office, saying he'd like to pick up where Senator Dole left off. Because he wasn't on the Senate Judiciary Committee, we reworked the outstanding provisions of the Bi-Dole Act as an amendment to the Stevenson-Wilder Act. That law fell under the jurisdiction of the Senate Commerce Committee, which is where Gordon served. Norm and I had to smile at the irony of rewriting an amendment to Bi-Dole to the rival bill Senator Stevenson had created. But flexibility goes hand in hand with moving policies forward. With the impact of university technology transfer growing before its eyes, Congress did not have the same philosophical debates over whether or not public-private sector partnerships were good policy. That they were essential to the nation's future was now a given. The new law, named the Federal Technology Transfer Act, extends Bi-Dole to the entire federal laboratory system, including the ability to share royalties with their inventors and use remaining funds for additional research. The extension of the Bi-Dole system, on top of what it had done to open up our academic research institutions, set off an unprecedented innovation explosion that continues to this day. It caused the Economist Technology Quarterly to say, quote, possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in the past half century was the Bi-Dole Act of 1980. More than anything, this single policy measure helped to reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance. That's quite a statement, and it's more than hyperbole. When I was at the Department of Commerce, we had a classified briefing from the CIA telling us the US had already lost its lead in three of the top 10 critical technologies, and predicting that we would soon lose many more. Not only did that not happen, but we regained our lead in all 10 due to the R&D partnerships formed between our entrepreneurial companies, academic research institutions, and federal laboratories. Here are some more impacts of Bi-Dole. In 1980, only 390 patents were issued to universities. Last year, they received 8,706. An economic impact study shows that academic patent licensing contributed $1.7 trillion with a T to our economy between 1996 and 2017, while supporting 6 million good-paying jobs. We create an average of 3 new companies from university inventions and develop 2.5 new products every day of the year. No other country comes close to these numbers. We form more than 15,000 startup companies. Small businesses license about 70% of all Bi-Dole inventions. Before Bi-Dole, not a single new drug had been developed when the government took patents away from universities. Today, we have more than 300 drugs and vaccines based on academic inventions, fighting disease around the world. Last year, our public and private sectors seamlessly formed critical partnerships to fight COVID-19. As a result, we developed the most effective vaccines in the world in record time. Now a COVID pill created through Bi-Dole promises to keep most patients out of the hospital. And last year, even in the midst of the pandemic, the impact of university patent licensing and startup company formation actually went up. Bi-Dole has become the recognized best practice in the world. Countries from South Africa to China have adopted it to better integrate the research universities into their country's development. Under Bi-Dole, entrepreneurs are encouraged to accept the risks and expenses of commercializing early stage federally funded inventions. Most time, these efforts fail. When they do, it's the company and not the government that takes a hit. But there are enough successes that venture capitalists are willing to invest in the small companies that drive innovation forward. One story illustrates how our system works. A couple of students at Stanford University created a new search engine with National Science Foundation funds. Despite trying hard, the tech transfer office could not find anyone interested in the technology. Finally, the students asked if they could get a license as they wanted to start their own company. Lacking any alternatives, the university agreed and took a percentage of the ownership, but declined to ask for any royalties, as they thought the odds of success against these kids was overwhelming. However, they did succeed. The company is called Google. You might think that with such demonstrated successes that Bi-Dole would be universally lauded. But those who fought it in 1980 have never given up in their attempts to undermine the law, and unfortunately have convinced many policymakers to join their crusade. 20 years after Bi-Dole passed, Norm Lacker contacted me and asked if I'd seen a law school article claiming to have found the secret meaning in Bi-Dole that allowed the government to set prices on resulting products. Unlike the novel The Da Vinci Code, lawmakers don't hide secret meanings in legislation, and we certainly didn't do so in Bi-Dole. Norm sent me a copy of the article. It rambled on for many pages, quoting non-Bi-Dole hearings and our critics to build its case. I laughed at the absurdity of this approach and put it on my shelf. Then a few weeks later, an op-ed paying twice for the same drugs appeared in the Washington Post by the authors hyping their theory. I contacted Senator Bayh, saying this is a serious threat to the law, as it would turn Bi-Dole on its head. He agreed and contacted Senator Dole. They decided to write a rebuttal, but the Washington Post would only give them the limited space of a letter to the editor for their reply. Senators Bayh and Dole stated, quote, "For every $1 spent in government research on a project, at least $10 of industry development will be needed to bring a product to market. Moreover, the rare government-funded inventions that become products are typically 5 to 7 years away from being commercial products when private industry gets involved. This is because almost all universities and government labs are conducting early-stage research. Bi-Dole did not intend the government set prices on resulting products. The law makes no reference to a reasonable price that should be dictated by the government. The article also mischaracterized the rights retained by the government under Bi-Dole. The ability of the government to revoke a license granted under the Act is not contingent on the pricing of resulting products or tied to the profitability of the company that commercialized it. The law instructs the government to revoke such licenses only when the private industry collaborator has not successfully commercialized the invention as a product. The law we passed is about encouraging partnerships that spur advances to help Americans. We are proud to say it's working." 2 years later, the first petition was filed under the flawed theory asking NIH to march in to regulate prices. NIH decided to hold a public meeting, and I urged Senator Bayh to attend. When NIH subsequently invited him to speak, he accepted, and I went with him. March-in rights are used under Bi-Dole to ensure that good faith efforts are being made to commercialize a federally funded invention. Their use preceded Bi-Dole, and they've always been used for that purpose. The law also allows the government to march in, forcing a university to license other companies if necessary to meet the needs of a public emergency which the licensee cannot satisfy. It was never intended that the government should micromanage the system. After all, the essence of Bi-Dole is decentralized technology management by allowing it to set the price of a successfully developed product. There's nothing in the statute or the legislative history suggesting this. But nevertheless, the critics who fought Bi-Dole hoped to convince NIH that they had discovered one. Senator Bayh demolished their argument, but he did so without any name-calling or theatrics, as was his way. He calmly showed how the petition flagrantly misrepresented the report of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I'd written, combining two unrelated provisions to give the false impression that we intended for government to set prices. Senator Bayh added that anyone is free to second guess us and say that we should have included such a provision. But that requires amending the law, not inventing something from whole cloth 20 years later. He added that if Congress ever does amend the statute, it must define precisely what it means by saying that resulting inventions must be reasonably priced, as the critics contend. Leaving this up in the air, expecting that entrepreneurs will take the considerable risk and expense of commercialization, only to have their rivals misuse the law to copy their inventions, would kill our system. Under Bi-Dole, anyone can file a march-in petition, a rival company, your disgruntled brother-in-law, or those who want to undermine Bi-Dole. Remember, too, that our system is driven by small companies who bet the farm on 1 or 2 patents. What venture capitalist would ever fund these companies with this sword hanging over their heads, which would only fall once a product was in the marketplace? The atmosphere at the NIH event was supercharged. Attending were many AIDS patients and their families concerned they would not be able to afford their medicine. Most politicians would have made their statement and quickly fled. But Birch Bayh was not like most politicians. Instead, we sat through the entire hours-long event, including listening to the critics misrepresent our law. When the meeting was over, Senator Bayh walked around the room talking with the families. He expressed his concern, but explained that we needed to address the high cost of healthcare, but we didn't want to inadvertently undermine the development of new treatments needed to fight diseases like AIDS. His sincerity was evident, and he received a lot of hugs and words of thanks before he left. I was proud to walk by his side. NIH agreed with Senator Bayh and dismissed the petition. Every subsequent attempt to misuse march-in rights in this fashion has been denied by every administration, Democratic or Republican, which has heard them. is not being supported by the law. The Obama-Biden administration dismissed the most. Nevertheless, the critics continue to this day to push their false narrative. Critics now hope that the successor to Dr. Francis Collins, the highly successful NIH director who just announced his retirements, will adopt their view. Dr. Collins knows more than anyone that rather than controlling costs, attempts to have the government second-guess pricing decisions would collapse the system. Indeed, that happened once before. In the early 1990s, congressional pressure was applied to browbeat NIH into including a reasonable pricing provision in its licenses and cooperative agreements, just as critics are demanding now. What NIH soon discovered is that rather than lowering drug costs, collaborations with industry collapsed. After 5 years, then NIH Director Harold Varmus rescinded the provision, saying that it accomplished no public purpose, but it only prevented critical partnerships from being formed. Agreements with NIH rapidly increased after the repeal. As we just saw last year, because Bi-Dole provides certainty and predictability, when the COVID crisis arose, our public and private sectors came together seamlessly to fight the pandemic. We developed the most effective vaccines in months rather than years. And just a few weeks ago, it was announced that the clinical trials of a novel COVID pill, licensed to a small company under Bi-Dole, promises to reduce hospitalizations by half. The commercialization partner Merck is gearing up for worldwide distribution, and the Biden administration is making advanced purchases to have the pill distributed as soon as it's approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Because of the high-profile debate, the fact checker at the Washington Post decided to look into the critics' claims. Here's his devastating conclusion. In the 2 decades since Marchin was identified as a way to control drug prices, advocates of this approach have struck out every time they've sought to advance it. No administration or court has ever accepted this reasoning. For now, it remains just a theory, not a tool that's ever been used in this way by the federal government. The fact checker didn't give the theory any Pinocchios, meaning it's obviously untrue, quote, despite its dismal track record, because it falls into the realm of opinion. That took some of the wind out of the sails of the critics, but they're sure to be right back. 2 years ago, we formed the Bi-Dole Coalition to celebrate the law's 40th anniversary. 96-year-old Senator Robert Dole made a very moving tribute to his former colleague, Senator Birch Bayh. We also wanted to remind policymakers, the media, and the public how the law works and why it's critical that it be appreciated and protected. We've decided to keep the coalition going in the face of the renewed threats to Bi-Dole. It just shows that passing fundamental change in public policy is not the end. They must be protected, and that's turned into my life's work. I had no idea that one meeting in 1978 was going to dictate the course of my professional life. But it's a real privilege to have been a member of the team that developed Bi-Dole. Norman Latker, Howard Brimmer, Ralph Davis, and Senator Bayh are all gone. There aren't many of us left who were directly involved in creating and passing Bi-Dole. But as long as I can, I'll push back on the revisionist histories and continue to hold the fort. I owe that to those who worked so hard and sacrificed so much to ensure that billions of hard-earned taxpayer dollars invested in federally funded R&D are not being squandered, but are turned into useful products protecting public welfare while growing our economy. I hope that each of you gets the experience of working with somebody as inspiring as Birch Bayh. He taught me a lot. He felt that we should treat others with respect, whether they agree with us or not. That's a lesson that's sorely needed today. So thank you once again for inviting me to give the Birch Bayh lecture. Having the opportunity to work with Birch Bayh was the greatest honor of my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. What a fascinating presentation and a masterclass in how legislation takes place. I have a few questions in the chat. I'll use moderator's privilege to pose a first question, which is whether you could say a little bit more about march-in rights under the Act, as that seems to be a centerpiece of the resistance to the legislation.
Yeah, march-in rights, as I mentioned, precedes Bi-Dole. And the purpose of government patent policy has always been to make sure that if you give somebody ownership or an exclusive license, that they're actually trying to move a product to market. So we didn't make up march-in rights. We adopted what was already there going back to the Truman administration. which says that if we give someone a license or they own the invention under the waivers before Bi-Dole, that they had to be making good faith efforts to move it to market, or the government could march in, quote unquote, and license somebody else. So that's the main purpose. We also added a couple other categories. We said that we want to make sure that maybe you have commercial, maybe you're doing the best you can. Bravo and company is moving forward, but a national emergency like COVID came up, and maybe you can't produce enough product to meet the needs of a national emergency. Then in that case, the government can also march in. And if you agreed in getting a license that you're going to make it in the US and you didn't, the government could march in. So that's the way the law worked for 20 years. As I mentioned, there was a law review article, not written at Indiana University, by the way, I'd like to add, that came back, and these guys said they discovered a magic meaning. And under Bi-Dole, under the first one that talks about you're actually moving to market, under Bi-Dole, that's limited to the patent owner. Okay, the patent owner is a university. They don't set prices. So what we said was, we said you have to, we want to make sure you're making good faith efforts to commercialize it. And also we want to make sure that it's available on reasonable terms. What does that mean? What that means is, remember in 1980, not many universities had a tech transfer office because they didn't own any inventions. So a lot of universities contracted that out to people like Research Corps or University Patents, Inc. And so Bi-Dole was a leap of faith. We said, okay, we're going to let people like Indiana University own it, but we also want to make sure that these new people have reasonable terms in there. You're not asking for $1 million up front or licensing your brother-in-law. We want to make sure this is it's actually done above board. So that's what we meant by reasonable terms. The critics took that and said, okay, reasonable terms mean reasonable pricing. Therefore, that was a secret meaning. Again, you don't have the luxury of looking back forward 20 years to what somebody could misrepresent, but there's nothing in the legislative history, there's nothing in the statute. And if we'd meant that, the first trigger would have applied to the licensee. The licensee sets the price, not the university. So that's why that every agency, every administration, going back to the Bush administration, continuing to the Obama-Biden administration, that's looked at the issue, said, no, price control is not part of Bi-Dole. It's clearly, we want to make sure it's commercially available, or there's significant, it's being produced enough to meet a national need. But unfortunately, I think after a while, people start believing their own propaganda. So this has continued on and on and on. Like I said, even the Washington Post, which a lot of times you think would be sympathetic to the other side, looked at this. And I got to give him credit, because the Washington Post reporter, you don't find a lot of reporters that actually do their own research and actually weigh both sides, but he really did. And he was vigorous to work with. Anything I said to him, I had to document. And so did the other side. And so he looked at this impartially and said, this theory doesn't hold water. Bi-Dole is not intended to control prices. But, again, you can't look 20 years down the road for what somebody can do to misrepresent what you're doing. But as Senator Bayh said, if we had intended the law to control prices, and prices had to be controlled reasonably, you would have to define that in the statute. You can't just leave that up in the air and say, oh, after you've commercialized something, if a foreign rival doesn't like it, they can say, we don't like the price, and take it away from you. So I don't want to go on too long there, but again, for 20 years, no one thought that. The people that they're promoting that are people that didn't like Bi-Dole in the beginning. So what they're saying is, don't listen to Bayh, don't listen to Dole, listen to us. Well, if you're interpreting a statute, you're much better based on talking to people like myself, who actually wrote the law, wrote the report, did the legislative history, than the people that tried to kill it as far as trying to interpret what it means.
Thanks very much, Joe. We're at time, but I'm so tempted to pose questions that I see here in the Q&A, and maybe I'll aggregate them. Questions centering on why should private universities benefit from technologies which were developed with the taxpayers' money, in addition to or interrelated the question of the high cost of pharmaceutical drugs, and that this is one of the reasons why Bi-Dole may be subject to challenge.
Okay, well, two things. First of all, the government is not paying for development. If IU gets a research grant, you're doing research. You're not being paid to develop a product. You don't have the expertise to develop a product. what was happening was, but a lot of times, like let's use Emory University. Emory University had NIH funding that came up with the technology that looked like it could turn into a COVID pill. Emory University could not develop a COVID pill. So you have to find somebody in the private sector. The risk and expenses of development falls on the private sector partner. And if they fail, no one pays them back. So the question is, how do you take this early stage research that's being funded by the government, again, not to develop products, but to forward the frontiers of knowledge. And if an invention does come out, how do you get it commercially used? We've tried both experiments. We've tried what the critics say. The critics say, put it in the public domain, let everyone have it, and magically it'll turn into a product. That didn't happen. We did it for 40 years. We tried the Bi-Dole approach. Let people like Indiana University that make an invention have the incentive to manage it, work with a private company, and like Emory just did with Ridgeback Biopharmaceuticals, sorry, say that a couple of times. They actually, in less than a year, they've gone from a research idea into what looks like it could be a breakthrough pill. So Bi-Dole is focused on the commercialization. Why healthcare is expensive is a completely different issue. And as we just saw at NIH, if you try to mix the two, Bi-Dole can't carry the weight of trying to fix the healthcare system. Why are drugs expensive? Because drug development is one of the highest risk things that anybody can do. More than 95% of new ideas for drugs fail in the pipeline. And when they fail in the phase 3 stage, they're extremely expensive and high risk. So under our system, the private sector is paying for that. Where the government is developing things is where the market may be limited and the high risk is so great, like in COVID, that there's a national priority to get these things commercialized. So they're really two separate issues. And what we're saying is, and what Senator Bayh said is, listen, address healthcare head on. You're in Congress, you write laws, address that head on. Don't try to pile that under Bi-Dole into something that doesn't even apply, because the worst of all scenarios is you kill innovation and don't lower prices. So it's a legitimate issue about getting healthcare down. But the other thing is, let's not lose sight of what we're doing, because just think about it. 18 months ago, which wasn't that long ago, there were no therapies for COVID other than wearing a mask and stay away from people. Because of public-private partnerships, and industry took most of the risk. Despite what you read, industry took most of the risk in these partnerships. We have developed new vaccines now in record time. They were in the history of humanity. Vaccines have never been developed in less than years and years. We developed them in months, and they're the best vaccines in the world. There's Chinese and Russian vaccines. I don't know too many people, even in China and Russia, they want to take Chinese and Russian vaccines. We have a new pill now that came out of a partnership with a small company, working with a larger company later, but initially a small company, which looks like it could reduce hospitalizations 50%. Now, why do we do all the COVID? Why are you right now wearing masks in Indiana? Because one of the concerns is we don't want to get the hospital systems overrun by COVID patients. That's a legitimate concern. If we could reduce that by 50%, what would that mean to the public sector? So the Bi-Dole system is working, but it's a separate question from the expenses of healthcare. And we've seen by experience, we did it at NIH, we've run these experiments. For 5 years, NIH tried to put price control onto tech transfer. It didn't lower prices, it just killed innovation. So, in the real world, things are complicated, but the politicians that are coming up with simple solutions, you're in Congress, you write laws, do that. Take it on. Don't just try to throw it on to some other statute and misrepresent it, because it's not going to solve the issue. And this is a really complicated issue. But the other thing I'll say is, where are the new drugs developed? The United States develops more new drugs and vaccines than anywhere else in the world combined. So before we trash our system, I think somebody will look and say, wait a minute, okay, they are expensive, but drugs are coming out now. And the problem is that their estimates are that it takes $800 million to $2 billion to develop a drug with a 95% failure rate. So by their very nature, they're not going to be cheap to do, but we should be looking for ways to change the system as much as we can. But the last thing you want to do is kill the golden goose, which is laying the egg, to throttle the poor golden goose because she's not laying more eggs. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a very good way to go forward. So I don't want to rattle on too long, but in real life, things are complicated. If you hear a simple solution that some politician just throws off the top of their head and they've never done it, that's a good symbol that maybe it's not quite as simple as that. So, again, we have a 40-year history of Bi-Dole that works. The Chinese have adopted Bi-Dole to compete against us. So they're pretty pragmatic people. So I'd say there's pretty good evidence that Bi-Dole works, but it can only carry so much. It can't carry the whole weight of controlling healthcare costs.
Thank you so much, Joe. We could continue on for, I think, at least another hour, but I want to really take this opportunity to thank you once again for such an interesting lecture, which in addition to honoring the legacy of Senator Doe, also taught a masterclass in how to do legislation and gave us such a wonderful look behind the scenes. Can I say thank you for being such a champion of this legislation? And on behalf of the IU McKinney School of Law, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I should say good evening to everyone. I hope that you have a wonderful evening and that you feel as educated as I do, having heard from Mr. Allen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.